In the small town of Redwood Valley, 17-year-old Jamal Carter had everything. Friends, family, a future. But on one fateful night in 1999, he vanished without a trace. No scream. No sign of struggle. Just gone. His family waited. His friends searched. But the truth remained locked away for 20 long years. What really happened to Jamal that night? And why did it take so long to uncover the chilling secrets buried beneath the quiet surface of this sleepy town? Tonight, we finally unravel a mystery that shattered a community, and the shocking truth that no one could have predicted. This is not just a cold case, it's a race against time. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about justice, secrets, and the haunting cost of waiting too long for the truth. Jamal Carter wasn't just a name in Redwood Valley. He was the name. He was the kind of kid every parent wanted their child to be. A standout high school football player. His talent on the field was unmatched. But it wasn't just his athleticism that earned him respect. No, Jamal had something special. He had heart. His coaches spoke of him with admiration, his friends looked up to him, and his family, especially his girlfriend Tiffany, believed in him always. Jamal was the kind of person who made the world feel a little smaller, a little safer. And Redwood Valley. It felt like a place where nothing could ever go wrong. A place where people stuck together, where everyone knew everyone, and no one ever truly disappeared. And then there was Tiffany Rose, Jamal's girlfriend. Together they were the perfect match, the high school sweethearts that everyone rooted for. Their relationship was solid, built on trust and love. They spent their days dreaming about the future, about college, about careers, about the life they'd build together after high school. Jamal was Tiffany's rock, and Tiffany was Jamal's anchor. To see them together was to see a love that seemed invincible, like it could never be broken, no matter what the world threw their way. Every year, the town would hold its biggest event, the Redwood County Fair. It was the heartbeat of the town. The fair was more than just a carnival. It was a tradition, a celebration that marked the end of the harvest season. It brought families, friends, and neighbors together. The Ferris wheel stood tall, the colorful lights flashing against the night sky, while the sweet smell of kettle corn filled the air. Jamal, like every year, was there. It was a place of nostalgia for him, a place of celebration. A place where memories were made, memories he had grown up with. And for Tiffany, it was where they shared so many moments, where they first met, where they had their first kiss, where they dreamt about their future. But that night things were different. It started like any other fair night. Jamal had promised Tiffany he'd be right back. He needed to speak with Coach Daniels about the practice schedule for the next week. It was nothing unusual. Just a quick conversation, and then he'd be back. But Tiffany stood there, near the Ferris wheel, waiting for him. She looked at the clock. It was 9:43 p.m. She scanned the crowd, hoping to see Jamal walking toward her, with that familiar, easy smile of his. But he didn't come back. She waited, her heart beginning to race as the minutes passed. 9:45. 9:50. 9:55. Something wasn't right. The fairground was starting to empty as the night wound down, but Jamal still wasn't back. Tiffany searched the thinning crowd, every face unfamiliar. Where was he? What happened between 9:43 and 10:15? Why didn't he return? She hadn't heard anything. No screams. No cries for help. No sign of a struggle. Yet Jamal was gone. And from that moment on, Jamal Carter was never seen again. What happened in those 32 minutes? Where was Jamal? And why did no one see a thing? Before I begin, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. I'd love to know just how far this story is reaching. Sheriff Helen McCarthy was no stranger to the quiet rhythms of life in Redwood Valley. A seasoned investigator, she'd handled everything from the occasional farm dispute to the more serious cases that arose in a town where the biggest excitement was often the annual county fair. When Jamal Carter disappeared, she was the first to be called in. At first, there was a sense of disbelief. A missing person? In a town like Redwood Valley? It didn't make sense. Jamal wasn't the type to vanish without a word. He had a reputation for being responsible, dependable, and devoted to his community. Yet, as Sheriff McCarthy began to take the initial statements, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Jamal's disappearance was quickly categorized as a missing person case, the kind of situation where a teenager might have wandered off, or perhaps gone to meet friends, but it didn't take long for the doubts to creep in. The small town had always been a place where everyone knew everyone, where people felt safe, where strange things didn't just happen. And yet, here they were. Tiffany Rose had never imagined she'd find herself in a situation like this. She kept thinking, he's coming back any minute now. She kept telling herself, he's probably just stuck talking to Coach Daniels about something. Or maybe he got distracted by someone from school and is just running late. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, her optimism started to crack. Every time she checked the crowd, hoping to see Jamal walking toward her with that easy, confident smile of his, there was no sign of him. Her phone buzzed. More unanswered texts from her mom asking if everything was okay. She had told her mom it was fine earlier, but now the anxiety gnawing at her gut was unbearable. Jamal was supposed to be with her. The one constant. He would never just leave her hanging. By 10:15 p.m., with no word from Jamal and the fairgrounds clearing out, Tiffany's heart began to race with a cold, empty fear. She rushed around, asking anyone if they had seen Jamal, but no one had. The Ferris wheel operator Dale said he hadn't seen Jamal after the last ride, and neither had the game's attendants. It was as though Jamal had vanished into thin air. Sheriff McCarthy had hoped that this was just another small-town misunderstanding, a miscommunication. But the more she looked into Jamal's disappearance, the less it seemed like an accident or simple mistake. The investigation started slow. Too slow. When Jamal's truck was still parked in the fairground lot, his keys untouched and his wallet on the dashboard, Sheriff McCarthy knew this wasn't a case of a teenager skipping town. This wasn't like any of the missing person cases she had handled before. No one had seen Jamal leave the fairgrounds. No one had seen anyone leave with him. His friends, family, and even strangers had no idea where he went after leaving Tiffany near the Ferris wheel. For all the people at the fair, something so simple as a disappearing act was unheard of. And still, no one had seen a thing. Tiffany continued to search. She found Jamal's best friend, Jake Miller, loading a prize-winning Holstein into a trailer with his father. Jake hadn't seen Jamal either. The pair had been laughing together earlier, throwing rings at milk bottles, trying to win a prize. It was normal. It was fun. Nothing unusual about it. And yet Jamal was gone. With every passing minute, Tiffany's anxiety deepened. What was supposed to be a fun night at the fair had turned into a nightmare. She kept telling herself that Jamal would walk up any moment, apologizing for taking longer than expected. That would be like him. But nothing came. The sounds of the midway began to fade as carnival workers broke down booths, sweeping popcorn from the dirt pathways. Tiffany couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a mix-up. It couldn't be. She stood there, still, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. She'd called Jamal multiple times. No answer. He never went without answering her. He always picked up. Always. "Where are you, Jamal?" she whispered under her breath. "Where are you?" But as the night stretched on, the possibility of him returning grew smaller and smaller. The scene at the fairgrounds was quieting, with only the workers left behind to pack up the rides and booths. The twinkling lights of the Ferris wheel slowly dimmed, fading into the dark. The crowd had all but disappeared. And still Jamal hadn't returned. The question that lingered in the air, silent but undeniable, was why? Why hadn't anyone seen him leave? In a town like Redwood Valley, where everyone knew everyone, why had Jamal just vanished? There was no sign of a struggle. No shouts, no screams. Nothing. Just gone. Something wasn't right. And as the fairgrounds emptied and the search began, one question hung in the air. Where was Jamal Carter, and why was his disappearance so strange in a town where everyone knew everyone? Before we continue with Jamal's heartbreaking story, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you, my incredible subscribers, for your unwavering support. You're the reason this channel continues to grow, and it truly means the world to me. Stories like this take time, effort, and dedication to produce, but your support makes it all worth it. If this story has kept you on the edge of your seat, and if you believe that the truth, no matter how long it takes, deserves to be uncovered, please like this video and subscribe to this channel so that we can keep bringing you more powerful stories like this. Also, share this with someone who still believes in justice, or who has ever wondered how long the truth can remain buried. Turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know every time I drop another gripping video. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Jamal Carter wasn't just another teenager from Redwood Valley. He was the teenager. The kind of kid every parent hoped their child would grow up to be. Responsible, hardworking, and driven. At 17, Jamal had already achieved more than most could ever dream of. A star athlete, he was the heart of the Redwood Valley football team, the kind of quarterback that made his coach's heart swell with pride. But it wasn't just his athletic ability that set him apart, it was his character. Jamal was the type of person who made people feel seen. Whether he was tutoring classmates in geometry or helping out elderly neighbors with their groceries, he had an innate kindness that touched everyone around him. And Tiffany Rose. She was his rock. His best friend, his love. They'd been inseparable since middle school. Together they had dreams, big dreams, of life after high school. Tiffany had always been there, cheering him on at football games, helping him balance academics with sports. She was by his side for every victory, every challenge. They had already mapped out their future. Tiffany was going to become a veterinarian, and Jamal was set to take a full scholarship to the University of Iowa to play football. They'd talked about returning to Redwood Valley after graduation, raising a family, and settling down. Jamal dreamed of one day taking over the town's sports program, becoming a coach, and making the community proud. His life was just beginning. So full of promise. And then, in one awful moment, it all stopped. Tiffany had always known Jamal as someone who followed through. He was reliable. When he said he'd be back, he was. That's why, as she stood there waiting by the Ferris wheel, every minute that ticked by felt like an eternity. The sounds of the fair slowly faded away as the lights of the rides dimmed. Families began heading out, and yet Jamal didn't appear. She looked around again, straining her eyes through the thinning crowd. Her phone buzzed with messages from her friends, but Tiffany couldn't bring herself to respond. All she could think about was Jamal. She texted him again. "Where are you? Everything okay?" No response. The minutes felt like hours. Tiffany called him once, twice, 3 times. Each time, it went straight to voicemail. Jamal had never ignored her calls before. He always answered, even if it was just to tell her he was on his way. But tonight felt different. Jake Miller, Jamal's best friend, was the one person who might have some answers. He had been with Jamal earlier that night, laughing and throwing rings at milk bottles, trying to win a prize. Tiffany found him standing by the livestock barn, helping his father load a prize-winning calf into the back of their truck. His eyes were searching too, frantic like he already knew something was wrong. "Have you seen Jamal?" Tiffany asked, her voice shaky. Jake's face fell as he shook his head. "Last I saw him, he was heading off toward Coach Martinez about the practice schedule. But that was before the ride ended." He paused, a look of concern crossing his features. "I haven't seen him since." Tiffany's heart dropped. This was not like Jamal. Jake, trying to stay composed, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry. He's probably just caught up somewhere. You know how he is, always getting sidetracked with something." But Tiffany couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Jamal would never leave her hanging like this. Not without saying anything. By now, the search for Jamal was in full swing. Sheriff Helen McCarthy had arrived at the fairgrounds, taking charge of the investigation. Her first instinct was that this might just be another case of a teenager wandering off or being a little too caught up in the excitement of the night. But as she interviewed witnesses and started piecing together the events, a clearer, more unsettling picture began to form. Sheriff McCarthy interviewed the carnival workers, but most of them were busy packing up. The few who could spare a moment only had vague recollections. The Ferris wheel operator hadn't seen anything unusual. The game booth attendants hadn't noticed anything out of place. It was as though Jamal had simply evaporated into thin air. Tiffany told the sheriff about her last interaction with Jamal, the promise he made to be right back, and how, after all this time, he still hadn't returned. Sheriff McCarthy nodded, taking careful notes. She knew that something was off. The interviews with the fair organizers revealed that Jamal had been near the Ferris wheel just before the fair closed. He'd walked away to speak with Coach Martinez, but no one could confirm where he went after that. By 11 p.m., the fairgrounds were nearly empty. The night was winding down, but Jamal was still nowhere to be found. Tiffany sat on a bench by the fairground entrance, watching as the lights of the Ferris wheel flickered off one by one. The sound of the carousel was the last to stop. Jamal had never been late before. He was always there for her. But tonight something was different. Her stomach twisted with anxiety as she waited for news. The thoughts raced in her mind. Why wasn't he back? Where could he be? Her parents were waiting at home, and they had no idea what was happening. Tiffany didn't know how to tell them, didn't know how to explain that her boyfriend, the boy everyone in town loved, had vanished. She picked up her phone again, her hands trembling as she dialed Jamal's number for the 10th time. Again, no answer. The seconds dragged into minutes, and the minutes stretched into an hour. The air around her grew heavier, suffocating. The reality of the situation began to settle in. Jamal wasn't just late. He was gone. As Sheriff McCarthy continued her investigation, the question everyone was asking was the same. Where is Jamal Carter? The answer seemed elusive, like the air thickening around the fairgrounds as the search for Jamal turned from hope to frustration. The town of Redwood Valley had always been safe, quiet, predictable. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happened here. But now, a shadow had been cast over the community. A teenage boy, beloved by all, had disappeared without a trace. And no one could explain why. What happened to Jamal? Had someone seen something? Was there a struggle? Or did someone simply watch him disappear into the night? What are your thoughts on Jamal's background? Do you think the fact that he was a local hero added more weight to his disappearance? How would you have reacted if you were Tiffany, knowing that something wasn't adding up? Leave your thoughts below. I read and respond to each and every comment. Days had passed, and Jamal's disappearance was quickly evolving from a small-town mystery to a matter of deep concern. The town's search efforts, now a full-scale operation, hadn't turned up anything concrete. But that was about to change. It started with a routine construction project. The Redwood County Fairgrounds were being expanded to accommodate new food stalls and booths for future fairs, funded by a state grant aimed at revitalizing the town's economy. As bulldozers and excavators rumbled over the fairgrounds, no one had any idea that beneath the surface, something long buried and long forgotten was waiting to be discovered. The crew was digging through a section of the grounds near where the carnival rides had been set up in 1999 when the shovel hit something solid. At first, the workers assumed it was just another piece of discarded debris, perhaps a broken piece of carnival equipment or scrap metal left over from the teardown years ago. But the sound it made when struck was different. Curiosity piqued, the workers dug further, their shovels scraping against the earth, revealing a twisted piece of metal. It wasn't just scrap. Something far darker was buried underneath the fairgrounds. Slowly, methodically, the workers unearthed the object. It was an old BMX bicycle, the kind teenagers rode in the late 90s. But this wasn't any ordinary bike. It had clearly been damaged, the frame bent and twisted, as if someone had deliberately destroyed it before burying it. The tires were long gone, rotted away by years of exposure to the soil and elements, but the frame was still intact. And as the workers pulled it from the dirt, a chill ran down their spines. There was something eerily familiar about this find. The scene felt unsettling, as if the earth itself had been hiding a secret for all this time. The discovery of the bicycle would soon prove to be the first critical breakthrough in the case. But it wasn't just any bike, it had a connection to Jamal Carter. The bike had been buried near the spot where the carnival rides had once stood, right behind the Ferris wheel. The very area where Jamal had last been seen. The very spot where he'd vanished. As the investigation picked up, a name resurfaced: Ted Foster. Ted Foster had been a temporary worker at the fair that year. A carnival hand, brought in just weeks before the event to help with the setup and teardown. At first glance, Ted seemed like just another worker, blending into the background of the chaotic fairgrounds. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Ted had a sketchy history that didn't quite fit with his mild-mannered persona. He had a criminal background, a string of arrests that had been swept under the rug. His record included charges for public intoxication, a violent incident at a bar years before, and reports of erratic behavior that had raised red flags. Though the charges had never resulted in a serious conviction, Ted's history was enough to make investigators question his role at the fair. Why had Ted been hired for a job that involved so much responsibility? Setting up rides, handling equipment, being around young people, when his background was filled with signs of instability. As detectives dug deeper into Ted Foster's past, they began to uncover disturbing details about his behavior that, when looked at in retrospect, seemed to suggest he wasn't the average carnival worker. At the fair, Ted had been seen talking to Jamal on the night of his disappearance. Several witnesses recalled seeing Ted near the Ferris wheel, where Jamal had been just before he walked away to meet his coach. But no one had connected the two men until the investigation started to take shape. Ted's demeanor during interviews had raised further suspicion. His responses were vague, hesitant, as if he were trying to downplay his presence at the fair that night. His memories of the evening were clouded, inconsistent. One moment, he claimed he hadn't seen Jamal at all, and the next, he seemed to be unsure about the details of their interaction. Most troubling was the fact that Ted had worked at the fair for years, but there had been something about his behavior that night that felt off. His interactions with other carnival workers had been curt and erratic, his movements quick, almost as if he was trying to avoid attention. It became clear that Ted Foster's connection to Jamal's disappearance wasn't just circumstantial. It was starting to look far more deliberate. For Tiffany Rose, the disappearance of Jamal had shaken everything she knew about her small town. It had taken weeks for the first piece of tangible evidence to emerge, and the discovery of the buried bike only intensified her fears. Tiffany had always trusted the people around her, and now she was starting to question everything. She couldn't help but think back to the night at the fair, the way Ted had acted, the way he avoided eye contact with her when she asked if he'd seen Jamal. There was something about the way he carried himself that night that didn't sit right with her. Could Ted have known something? Could he have been involved? Tiffany knew that Jamal was the last person who would leave without telling her where he was going, without a word. And if Ted was hiding something, if he knew more than he was letting on, then maybe, just maybe, he was the key to unlocking the mystery. As investigators sifted through Ted Foster's history, they began to uncover more troubling patterns of behavior. It wasn't just that Ted had been a carnival worker with a questionable past. It was the fact that his life had been filled with incidents that seemed to show a deeper, more disturbing obsession with young people. Records surfaced about Ted's time in a neighboring town, where he'd been employed at a different fairground. His behavior there had been flagged by multiple co-workers. He'd been known to take an unusual interest in the teenagers he worked with, particularly the young girls. Reports about Ted's interactions at other fairs indicated a troubling pattern of inappropriate behavior and confrontations that had been overlooked by the employers at the time. Now, everything about his presence at the Redwood County Fair seemed to take on a more sinister light. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, But it still didn't explain why Jamal had been the victim. Why had Jamal been targeted? And how had Ted's history remained hidden for so long? As the investigation moved forward, more information surfaced about Ted Foster's activities, his connections to the fair, and his possible involvement in Jamal's disappearance. The mystery was deepening with every new discovery, but there were still so many unanswered questions. How much did Ted really know? Had he been part of a larger plan to hide what happened that night? What had really happened when Jamal walked away from Tiffany and disappeared into the darkness? With every new revelation, the investigation seemed to inch closer to the truth, but it also raised more disturbing questions. What dark secrets was Ted Foster hiding? Was he more involved in Jamal's disappearance than anyone knew? The investigation had stalled. What had once been a case of a missing teenager, someone so full of life, so promising, had become a case of grief. Tiffany Rose had started this journey with hope, her heart full of the belief that Jamal was out there, somewhere. It didn't matter that he hadn't called, that he hadn't returned her messages. Maybe he'd been caught up in something, or maybe he had just lost track of time. Maybe he was hurt but still breathing. But the days, then the weeks, had stretched into something unrecognizable. With every passing day, her hope began to drain, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. Tiffany had always prided herself on being the one to hold things together, but now she found herself suffocating under the weight of a reality that was becoming harder to deny. Each empty day without any new leads pushed her further into uncertainty, and the silence, the deafening silence, left her with questions she didn't want to ask. What happened to Jamal? Where could he be? What had gone wrong? Tiffany's mind replayed the last few moments she had shared with him at the fair. She kept remembering how his hand felt in hers, warm, solid, like he was never going to leave her. She had waited for him to come back, stood by the Ferris wheel, watching the crowd disperse, waiting for Jamal, believing he would come back with that familiar grin of his, that easy smile that had always made her feel safe. But as the hours turned to days, and the investigation had yet to offer any answers, hope began to waver. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. She had been to the fairgrounds every day since Jamal's disappearance, walking around in circles, asking anyone if they had seen him, and each day she was met with the same response. Nothing. Just the ghost of that final night, and the eerie emptiness left behind. Tiffany's search had become a personal crusade, even as the police efforts seemed to stall. She refused to sit back, to wait for someone else to find the answers. Her love for Jamal pushed her forward, but with every passing moment, it felt like that love was turning into something far more painful. Jamal's family, too, had been devastated. His mother, Margaret Rose, had nearly lost herself in the whirlwind of unanswered questions. She had barely slept, barely eaten, only managing to function enough to keep up the facade of hope for Tiffany, for her family. Jamal's father, Rick Rose, had not been the same either. The kind, strong man who had coached Jamal's football team and kept the town running smoothly, now seemed hollow, like someone had taken all the life from him. He had started working longer hours, kept to himself, and avoided talking about his son. But Tiffany fought. She wouldn't let Jamal be forgotten. She knew in her heart that someone knew something. Maybe it wasn't the police. Maybe it wasn't the town. Maybe it was a stranger, someone who had seen something and hadn't said a word. Despite the growing sense of despair, Tiffany's determination never wavered. Every day, she put up missing person flyers. She spoke with anyone who would listen, anyone who might have seen something, anything that could point to Jamal's whereabouts. She even organized small searches, bringing together the local community, but the results were always the same: nothing. It was as if Jamal had vanished from the earth without a trace. Tiffany became an advocate for Jamal's case, pushing local news outlets for more coverage. She appeared on television interviews, spoke at community meetings, and reached out to every connection she had. She didn't care how hard it was. She refused to stop fighting. But even she had to admit, as the weeks turned into months, her resolve began to fray. Then, one day, the unthinkable happened. A breakthrough. The detectives working on Jamal's case had hit a dead end time and time again. But then something unexpected happened. Evidence was uncovered, and this time it wasn't just a dead end. The forensic team had found something buried beneath the ground where the fairgrounds had once been. It was a BMX bicycle, the same kind Jamal had ridden as a teenager, the same kind his friends had talked about riding with him during their last summer together. But there was something off about it. It wasn't just an old bicycle. The bike was twisted, damaged in a way that made it seem like someone had deliberately destroyed it before burying it. And then the link clicked. This bicycle, this piece of evidence, was tied to someone who had been present at the fairgrounds during Jamal's disappearance. Ted Foster. Ted Foster had been a carnival worker who had worked at the Redwood County Fair in 1999. He had been one of many who had helped set up the rides, the games, the booths. He had worked quietly in the background, not the type to draw attention to himself. But there was a problem with Ted Foster, something the police had overlooked in the early stages of the investigation. Ted had a criminal record. It wasn't something that was widely known at the time, but as investigators dug deeper into his past, a disturbing pattern emerged. Ted Foster had been arrested multiple times, not for minor infractions, but for violent behavior, disorderly conduct, public intoxication, and most troubling of all, previous altercations with young people. These weren't just random incidents. They were troubling signs of a deeper, more sinister issue. But why had Ted never been considered a person of interest earlier? How had he slipped under the radar? As the investigation advanced, more witnesses came forward to describe Ted's odd behavior at the fair. A few carnival workers had mentioned that Ted had been acting strangely the night Jamal disappeared. He had been near the Ferris wheel, just as Jamal had been before he disappeared. Some even recalled seeing him in the same area, just a few minutes before Jamal vanished. But no one had paid it any real attention at the time. What was Ted Foster's role in all of this? Was he involved in Jamal's disappearance? For Tiffany, the discovery of the buried BMX bike only intensified her suspicions. She had always known that something wasn't right, but now it felt as though the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, albeit in a way she never expected. She couldn't shake the image of Ted Foster lingering around the fairgrounds. Her gut told her he knew more than he was letting on. And when she learned about his criminal history, her fear grew. What if Ted was more involved in Jamal's disappearance than anyone could have imagined? Was this some kind of twisted conspiracy? What was Ted hiding? As Tiffany grew more suspicious, she began digging into Ted's past. She spoke to others who had worked at the fairgrounds that year, seeking information that might have been overlooked. She wasn't going to stop until she knew the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But with each new discovery, the mystery only deepened. Ted Foster's actions, his shady past, his odd behavior, and his connection to Jamal seemed to suggest that Jamal's disappearance wasn't just a random act of fate. It was connected to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The deeper they dug into Ted's background, the more they uncovered. Ted wasn't just a carnival worker with a past. He had a history of predatory behavior. Investigators found reports from other fairs where Ted had been employed, and his interactions with minors had raised alarms. He had been warned, even reprimanded at previous events, but nothing had ever been done about it. Was Jamal the latest victim of a man who had been allowed to slip through the cracks for years? As the investigation closed in on Ted, more troubling details about his life surfaced. Ted had been living in various towns, moving from job to job, always keeping a low profile. But there was one thing that never changed: his presence at fairs. The connection was clear. Ted had been at the fair when Jamal disappeared, and now, with the discovery of the buried BMX bike, it seemed to point directly at him. But did Ted Foster truly know what had happened to Jamal? Was he hiding something even darker than anyone had realized? The investigation was moving fast now, but so many questions remained unanswered. What dark secrets was Ted Foster hiding? Was he more involved in Jamal's disappearance than anyone knew? The mystery was starting to unravel, But just when the detectives thought they had the answers, a new twist loomed on the horizon. What had Ted really been hiding? And what would be revealed when the truth finally came to light? The case had taken a terrifying turn, and it was clear that this was just the beginning. This act takes the investigation to a new level, with discoveries that open up new possibilities about Jamal's disappearance. Ted Foster's involvement, once overlooked, now takes center stage, and with it, the chilling realization that this case is far darker than anyone could have expected. The investigation had reached a critical point. The deep dive into Ted Foster's life and criminal history had raised more questions than answers. But with each new discovery, the walls were closing in on him. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the BMX bike had been unearthed from the soil, and now, with every passing day, the investigation gained momentum. Detective Mark Stevens, the lead investigator, had pushed hard during his interviews with Ted, who had been stubbornly uncooperative. Ted had already made his own assumptions about the case, but now, as investigators dug deeper, Ted's world was starting to crumble. He had been interviewed multiple times, each round more intense than the last. The pressure of being under suspicion for so long had taken its toll, and cracks were beginning to show in his story. "Do you understand what this bike means, Ted?" Detective Stevens had asked during one of their interrogations. The question wasn't just rhetorical, it was a calculated attempt to see how Ted would respond. The BMX bike, buried deep under the fairgrounds, now seemed to serve as a chilling link between Ted Foster and Jamal's disappearance. The evidence was undeniable, and every attempt Ted made to downplay his involvement in Jamal's disappearance felt more desperate, more feigned. Ted's initial claim had been that the bike was something he'd found in the trash, a forgotten relic from the past. But the more they probed, the more absurd his explanation sounded. There was no way that bike, with its visible damage and clear signs of deliberate destruction, had been discarded carelessly. It was the moment that the interview turned, "Ted, we've got the forensic results. This bike was yours, wasn't it?" Ted's silence spoke volumes. For the first time, there was a hesitation in his voice. The hard facade he had kept up for weeks seemed to crack, revealing something darker underneath. As the forensic team worked tirelessly on the physical evidence, they uncovered crucial information about the bike. It had been examined under a microscope, revealing tool marks, clear evidence that the bike had been violently damaged before it was buried. There was no way this was an accident. The damage was too precise. The questions now circled back to Ted. Had he been involved in Jamal's disappearance? What role did he play? As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it was clear that this was no random act of violence. The BMX bike was the key. It wasn't just an item associated with Jamal. It was the item that had bound Ted to the crime. And now, the investigators had more than enough reason to suspect Ted's involvement. But it wasn't just the bike that tied Ted to the case. As the investigation progressed, Ted's lies began to unravel. Early on, he had maintained that he had no idea who Jamal was, that he barely remembered the night of the disappearance. But as the interviews grew more intense, it became clear that Ted had been present at the fairgrounds that night. He had been in the very area where Jamal was last seen. The contradictions in his story were mounting. First, Ted claimed he had been near the Ferris wheel, but when confronted with new evidence, he changed his account, each new version of his story contradicting the last. His memory, it seemed, was conveniently selective. The investigators pressed him harder. Ted's demeanor shifted from defensive to agitated. "I told you I didn't see the kid," Ted had snapped during one of the later interviews. But it was too late for that. Every lead was pointing back to him. Every new development felt like a small victory. But still, the case wasn't closed. As the pressure mounted, Ted started to crack under the weight of his own lies. The investigators had to be cautious. They couldn't push too hard, couldn't break him just yet. They needed Ted to confess, and for that, they needed more than just circumstantial evidence. The forensic analysis was the next critical step. Ted had gone from a man who had been evasive to one who was now clearly hiding something. His behavior had been too suspicious to ignore. Jamal's family, still desperate for answers, were starting to see a glimmer of hope. Detective Stevens received an update from the forensic team. They had analyzed the damaged BMX bike, tracing it back to Ted Foster. They also uncovered significant evidence of Ted's involvement in other incidents that hadn't been reported previously. Incidents that involved minors. It was a chilling realization. Ted Foster wasn't just a suspect in Jamal's disappearance. He was a man with a history of preying on young people. Someone who had gotten away with it before, and now it seemed like history was repeating itself. For Tiffany, the updates were both relieving and horrifying. The weight of the truth was beginning to settle in, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. There were gaps, things that didn't add up, and she could feel it in her gut. There was still so much more to uncover. As the investigation built momentum, the urgency continued to grow. What Ted Foster knew, and how deeply involved he truly was, remained the central mystery. Each new revelation pointed to the same conclusion. Ted Foster was connected to Jamal's disappearance in ways that couldn't be ignored. But one thing remained. Did Ted Foster really have the courage to confess? Did he truly understand the consequences of his actions, or was he still lying, trying to cover up the truth? The question that kept gnawing at the investigators, and at Tiffany, was whether they had finally hit the point of no return. Ted Foster had been backed into a corner, his lies unraveling piece by piece. But even with all the evidence in front of him, the question remained, what did Ted Foster know about Jamal's disappearance? Had he finally come to terms with the truth, or was he still holding on to his secrets? The real question now, would Ted Foster finally break and reveal the horrific truth that had haunted this case for years? Or would he keep hiding behind his web of lies, dragging Jamal's family further into the abyss of uncertainty? And as investigators closed in on him, the chilling realization dawned, whatever Ted Foster knew, the answers were about to come to light. But would they be enough to finally bring justice to Jamal Carter? We're getting close now. Do you think Ted Foster is ready to crack under pressure? What do you think he's hiding, and how much do you think the investigation has missed before now? Was there anything you saw coming that we didn't? Let me know your opinion in the comments below. I read and reply to all of them. The investigation had already felt like a twisting maze, but just when they thought they were closing in on the truth, a new discovery shook everything. A revelation that no one saw coming. A piece of evidence long overlooked, buried in the depths of Ted Foster's past. It was a journal. Ted Foster's journal. It wasn't just any journal. As investigators flipped through its pages, it became clear that Ted's obsession with young people went far deeper than anyone had imagined. The words were haunting, sketchy, incoherent at times, but the patterns were unmistakable. There it was, written in the hurried, disjointed scrawl of someone losing control. I need to be in control. They never see me coming. Detective Stevens held the journal in his hands, turning the pages slowly as the weight of what he was reading sank in. There were entries describing Ted's obsession with the carnival and the way he interacted with the younger employees, especially the teenagers who worked alongside him during the fair. Ted wrote about the power he felt when he could manipulate them, how he could control their actions without them ever knowing. And most chilling of all, Ted spoke about the perfect cover, his ability to blend in, to be invisible. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been overlooked, ignored, until now. As Stevens read the journal, his stomach twisted. It became clear that Ted had been more than just a carnival worker. He had been a predator hiding in plain sight. His past actions, his strange behavior, it all fit into a chilling narrative that no one had considered before. The journal revealed a side of Ted Foster that was darker, more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. But how had this been missed? How had Ted Foster slipped through the cracks for so long? It seemed impossible that something this significant could have gone unnoticed. The answer wasn't as simple as Ted being an expert liar. It was about the investigation itself, how it had been rushed in the beginning, how the town's attention had been diverted by the chaos of Jamal's disappearance. In the initial stages of the investigation, Sheriff McCarthy and the team were focused on the obvious leads. They questioned carnival workers, fair attendees, and friends. But no one dug deeper. Ted had been questioned, but no one suspected his history or his disturbing tendencies. He was just another carnival worker, a small cog in a big machine. But now it was clear that this journal and Ted's sketchy past had been the missing link. This journal held secrets that were far darker than anyone had realized. It was a glimpse into a troubled mind that had been operating undetected for years. And Jamal had been his victim. Whether he had been targeted by Ted from the beginning, or simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, it became apparent that Ted had been involved in far more than just Jamal's case. This was the kind of behavior that didn't stop. It festered, it grew, it multiplied. And Jamal had just been the latest in a long line of victims. As the journal made its way through the hands of the investigators, the true extent of Ted Foster's involvement in Jamal's disappearance became undeniable. But the revelations didn't stop there. As they began to connect the dots, they uncovered something far more disturbing. Ted Foster wasn't just connected to Jamal's case. He had a long history that linked him to multiple other missing persons cases, stretching back years. Investigators began to piece together the unsettling connections between Ted and disappearances from several neighboring towns over the years. Each case had been marked by young people vanishing under strange circumstances, often around carnivals or fairs, events Ted had been involved in. Each disappearance, though different in its details, shared eerie similarities. The victims were young, vulnerable, and had all attended local events where Ted had worked. It was as if Ted had been following a pattern, a twisted, sickening pattern. And what made it worse was that these disappearances had been chalked up to freak accidents or runaways, with little to no investigation into the deeper connection between them. Ted Foster had left a trail of chaos in his wake, and no one had thought to connect the dots. But the question remained, what else had Ted been hiding? The journal was only the beginning. There were still so many unanswered questions. What exactly had Ted done to Jamal the night he disappeared? How had he gotten away with it for so long? And most terrifying of all, what would happen when the full truth was revealed? As the case against Ted Foster continued to build, the pressure on him intensified. The authorities had enough evidence to charge him with multiple counts of kidnapping, but there were still gaps in the story. Gaps that only Ted could fill. Detective Stevens knew that they were closing in on him. Ted's behavior was becoming more erratic as the investigation progressed. The more they uncovered, the more desperate Ted became. He was no longer the calm, collected man he had appeared to be. The walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. But even with all the evidence pointing toward Ted Foster, there was still one lingering question. Was he finally ready to face the truth? Would he break under the pressure and reveal the full extent of his crimes, or would he remain silent, keeping the answers locked inside his twisted mind? As Detective Stevens prepared to confront Ted one last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something even darker. The truth about Jamal's disappearance was close, but the full story, the one that would explain everything, was still hidden in the shadows. What had Ted Foster been hiding for all these years? What other secrets lay buried in the recesses of his mind, waiting to be uncovered? The tension was palpable, the mystery was thick, and the truth, while within reach, was still just out of grasp. Was this the moment they'd all been waiting for? Would Ted finally crack? Or would he continue to keep his secrets buried deep, just like the BMX bike that had become the key to unlocking everything? The truth was almost within their grasp. But the question remained, just how deep did Ted Foster's involvement in Jamal's disappearance really go? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Jamal Carter wasn't just a missing person. He wasn't just a case to be solved. Jamal was the heartbeat of Redwood Valley, the kind of kid everyone looked up to, a beacon of hope for a town that never asked for much. Jamal's disappearance had shattered that hope, breaking something within the very fabric of Redwood Valley. His family was devastated. Tiffany Rose, the love of his life, had never stopped believing that Jamal would come back. But as the years passed, as the investigation stalled, a part of her began to wither. The hopeful girl who once believed love could conquer all found herself staring into the abyss of uncertainty. The small town, with its quiet streets and close-knit families, had been forced to confront a brutal truth. Their idealized sense of security was a facade. How could a boy like Jamal just disappear without a trace? The town had raised him, watched him grow, cheered for him on Friday nights. How could someone like him just vanish? The questions plagued the community for years. The memories of Jamal, the way he smiled, the way he ran down the field with such ease, were seared into the hearts of everyone who knew him. And yet, for over 20 years, no answers came. Tiffany spent sleepless nights waiting for answers that never came. Jamal's mother, Grace, tried to carry on, grieving in silence, while still holding out hope that one day Jamal would walk through the door again. But hope became a fragile thing. Each year that passed, that hope felt less like a promise and more like a dream fading with time. Friends, family, the entire town, they all felt the absence of Jamal, the shadow that his disappearance cast over their lives. And as the investigation trudged along, the emotional toll weighed heavily on all of them. Jamal's legacy was one of love, promise, and potential. Yet all of that had been stolen away in a single moment of horror. But the true weight of Jamal's disappearance didn't just fall on his family. It had an even darker undertone, one that lay hidden in the depths of Ted Foster's mind. Ted, the carnival worker, had been a figure who seemed to drift in and out of the background, a shadow among the crowds. But as the investigation into Jamal's case deepened, the extent of Ted's twisted psyche began to surface. What drove Ted Foster? What made him capable of such manipulation, such cruelty? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just a matter of a man caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, Ted's obsession with young people, with control, and with manipulation had festered over years. His criminal history, brushing up against violence, abuse, and coercion, painted a disturbing picture. Ted had been unremarkable in many ways, but the deeper layers of his mind were far from ordinary. His fixation on younger people had been growing for years. The journal, the letters, the unspoken desire to exert control over others, it was all there. Ted's obsession wasn't just with Jamal. It was with power. Power over others. Power over life and death. Power over the helpless. He had carefully constructed his life to avoid suspicion. His charm, his ability to blend in, his knack for keeping things hidden in plain sight, these were the tools he used. And yet, despite the dark inclinations that had always simmered beneath the surface, Ted never thought he would be caught. His belief in his own invincibility made him dangerous. His tendency to target vulnerable young men and women, especially those who were beloved and trusted by their community, made his actions even more horrific. Ted's twisted need for control, his hunger for dominance over the lives of those around him, it wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a carefully constructed plan years in the making. Ted wasn't just a predator by circumstance. He had become a predator by choice. The cruelty with which he manipulated Jamal and the circumstances surrounding his death were a reflection of his deep-seated emotional dysfunction. And his inability to see the humanity in the people he victimized made it all the more chilling. In the midst of this emotional turmoil, Jamal's younger brother, Ben Carter, found himself standing in the shadow of his older sibling's memory. Ben had always looked up to Jamal, his older brother, the star athlete, the one who had it all. But with Jamal's disappearance, Ben found himself in a world that was different from the one he had known. Ben had always been the quieter one, content to follow in Jamal's footsteps but never quite stepping into the same limelight. But with his brother gone, Ben's world shifted. He was no longer just Jamal's little brother. He had to step up and become a voice for his brother's legacy. In the years following Jamal's disappearance, Ben watched as his family crumbled under the weight of unanswered questions. His mother, once full of life, became a hollow shell of the woman she had been. His father, a man who had been strong for so many years, now seemed broken, his once bright eyes clouded with grief. And Tiffany. Tiffany became a ghost of the woman she had once been, forever haunted by Jamal's absence. Ben could no longer sit in silence. He wasn't the golden child like Jamal had been, but he knew he had a role to play in this story. Jamal deserved justice. His family deserved answers. And as the years passed, Ben found himself growing into a fierce advocate for his brother's memory. He was no longer the passive observer in his brother's life. He was now the one fighting to uncover the truth. The boy who had once been content to follow in his brother's footsteps now found himself leading the charge, pushing for justice when no one else could. The emotional toll on Ben was immense, but it was a journey he knew he had to make. The pain of not knowing had become unbearable, and now he stood ready to take on the responsibility of finding out what had happened to Jamal. Ted's need for control was just one layer of a much deeper, more twisted reality. His actions were fueled by something more than just opportunism. They were rooted in an obsessive need to dominate, to possess. But why? What had happened in his life that led him down this dark path? Ted had grown up in an environment where emotional neglect and dysfunction were rampant. His family was fractured, his father absent, his mother cold and distant. From a young age, Ted learned that power was the key to survival. In his mind, controlling others, controlling their emotions, and manipulating their lives were the only ways to feel truly alive. By the time Ted reached adulthood, he had become skilled in reading people, in recognizing their vulnerabilities, and in using them to his advantage. He didn't just see the world as a place for opportunities. He saw it as a playground where he could orchestrate the lives of others. His obsession with young people, with their innocence, was rooted in his belief that they were the easiest to control. They were the blank slates he could rewrite. As the investigation continued to unravel Ted's past, the pieces began to fall into place. His obsession wasn't just an afterthought. It was a calculated behavior that had been carefully cultivated over the years. His ability to hide his true nature from everyone around him made him all the more dangerous. No one suspected Ted Foster. No one ever thought he was capable of the monstrous acts he had committed. As the truth began to emerge, the emotional weight of the case became undeniable. Jamal's legacy, his bright future, his promise, his love for Tiffany, was overshadowed by the darkness that had claimed his life. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, it became clear that the emotional scars left by his disappearance would never fully heal. Tiffany, who had held on to hope for so long, now had to face the truth. Her grief wasn't just for the loss of Jamal, it was for the betrayal, the manipulation, and the crushing realization that the man who had taken her love away from her was someone she would have never suspected. Jamal's family, his parents, had tried to keep going, tried to live in a world without their son. But every birthday, every family event, every passing day was a painful reminder of the son they had lost, the son who had vanished without a trace. Ben, the younger brother, had to learn to live in the shadow of Jamal's memory. But as much as he missed his brother, he also knew that Jamal's legacy couldn't be defined by the loss alone. Jamal's legacy was one of hope, of perseverance, and of the fight for justice. But even as the investigation neared its conclusion, there was still something lurking in the background, a feeling that the full truth was still hidden, buried deep beneath layers of lies and deceit. The truth about Ted Foster, his obsession, his manipulation, his role in Jamal's death, was coming to light. But as the case reached its conclusion, the question remained. Was there more to the story than anyone had uncovered? Were there other victims? Other dark secrets waiting to be exposed? As the investigation neared its final stages, one thing was clear. Jamal's story, while resolved in many ways, was far from over. The shadows of his disappearance would continue to haunt Redwood Valley. And the truth about what happened that night at the fair, what really happened to Jamal Carter, would echo through the community for years to come. How deep did Ted Foster's involvement go? And what other chilling secrets had been buried for so long? The answers might have been within reach, but the full scope of the tragedy was still yet to be fully understood. We've seen the heart-wrenching tragedy of Jamal Carter's life cut short. His disappearance, the pain of his family, and the long, painful journey to uncover the truth. But let me ask you this, what could have been done to prevent this? What could have been done to protect Jamal in a small town, where everyone is supposed to know everyone? What steps could a community like Redwood Valley take to ensure that something like this never happens again? Was there a failure in the investigation that led to Jamal's disappearance being ignored for so long? Could the townspeople, the fair workers, the local authorities have done more? Was there a moment when someone could have stepped in and changed the course of this tragedy? Think about it. How can small towns protect their own? What systems, what practices, what awareness can be created to prevent this kind of tragedy from being repeated? Leave your thoughts, your reflections, your theories in the comments below. I read and reply to every single comment. This case might have closed, but the lessons, the discussion, and the need for awareness, that continues. If you've been moved by Jamal's story, if it's made you think deeply about justice, the failures in small-town security, and the devastating impact of one person's actions, don't just sit there. Share this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Whether they're from a small town or a big city, Jamal's story resonates with anyone who's ever had someone they love go missing, someone they've trusted taken from them. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world. It fuels me to bring you more true crime stories, to shine a light on the cold cases that have been waiting for justice, waiting for closure. So, go ahead. Hit the notification bell. Be the first to know when the next heartbreaking story is coming. You won't want to miss it. If you're hooked on these kinds of cold cases, on the unsolved mysteries that demand justice and truth, then keep your eyes peeled for the next video. I'll be diving into another case, one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about crime, justice, and redemption. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. As we've already seen, the pieces of the puzzle are finally starting to fall into place. For years, Jamal's family, his girlfriend Tiffany, his parents, his younger brother Ben, were forced to live in a world without answers, without the justice they so desperately needed. But now, the case is drawing closer to its final moments. Ted Foster, the man who had so carefully hidden his true nature, his dangerous obsessions for so many years, is finally being exposed for who he really is. His guilt, once murky, is now undeniable. The evidence, overwhelming. The connection to Jamal's death, crystal clear. For Jamal's family, for Tiffany, for everyone who loved him, this moment of revelation should bring closure. But how could it? How could you possibly close the door on something as traumatic as this? And then there's Tiffany, the girl who waited, the girl who held on to hope through years of uncertainty, who believed that the love they shared was strong enough to pull Jamal back from the brink of darkness. But now, as the full truth unfolds, what happens when the truth is worse than you could have ever imagined? Imagine the pain, the grief that hits when you realize the person you loved was not just taken from you, but was the victim of a sick, twisted plan set in motion years before. Tiffany's world crumbles as she hears the details. Ted's journal, his twisted obsession, his role in Jamal's death. It's the closure she never wanted. The kind of truth that breaks a person's spirit. And for Jamal's parents, Grace and Michael, there's no joy in this moment. No relief, not really. How do you reconcile the fact that your son's death was the result of someone who had spent years hiding in plain sight? Someone who had been right there, in their town, part of their world, and no one had seen him for what he was. They had spent over 2 decades in an emotional limbo, unable to grieve properly, unable to move on because the question why hung in the air. And now, finally, there's an answer. But it comes at a cost. The cost of their son's legacy being tainted by the horrific actions of a man who never should have been in their lives. But there's still something haunting about this case. Something that doesn't feel entirely right. Even with the investigation nearing its final chapters, there's a lingering question. What if the truth still hasn't been fully revealed? What if there are more hidden pieces to the puzzle? What if Ted Foster wasn't the only one with blood on his hands? What if his involvement with the fair and his obsession with young people is just the tip of the iceberg? For Tiffany, for Jamal's family, this will never feel like complete closure. The emotional wounds left by this case? They won't just heal with the revelation of the truth. The scars will remain forever, etched in their hearts. So, as we approach the end of Jamal's story, ask yourself this: how deep does this go? And more importantly, what happens when justice comes too late? When the emotional damage has already been done, and you're left to pick up the pieces of your life, shattered by the truth you never wanted to hear. Jamal's case may have reached its resolution, but the emotional scars remain. The questions remain. The long, painful journey for justice has ended. But has the truth really been fully uncovered? And more importantly, what happens when justice comes too late? The answers are finally here. But the pain, that's a whole different story. Ted Foster's arrest was both a bitter and necessary conclusion to the case that had haunted Redwood Valley for more than 2 decades. After years of unanswered questions and unrelenting heartbreak, the investigation had finally reached its painful conclusion. Ted Foster, the man who had lived quietly in the shadows for so long, now found himself facing the weight of his actions. His past, filled with criminal activity and twisted obsessions, had been laid bare for the world to see. His connection to Jamal's disappearance, the horrific circumstances surrounding the young man's death, everything had come to light in the cold, unforgiving glare of truth. But for Jamal's family, for Tiffany, for his friends, there was no joy in his capture. The damage was done. The hole that had been carved into their lives, that deep void left by his loss, could not be filled by Foster's arrest. It had taken more than 20 years for the truth to come out, and by then the world had moved on. But Jamal's family, they would never move on. No matter how many arrests were made, no matter how much justice was finally delivered, they would always carry that weight. The weight of a future stolen, a life cut short, a dream that could never be realized. The case was closed, yes, but for those who loved Jamal, the closure didn't bring peace. It never would. Tiffany Rose, who had once been a bright-eyed young woman full of hope and anticipation for the future, now found herself carrying the weight of grief in a way she could never have imagined. The young girl who had loved Jamal with all her heart was now a woman who had to learn to live with the hole he left behind. But healing, as impossible as it seemed, had begun. Tiffany had always promised herself that she would honor Jamal's memory. And she did. Through every tear, every sleepless night, every painful memory, Tiffany held on to one truth. Jamal was her first love, and though he was gone, he would never be forgotten. She honored his memory not by living in the past, but by ensuring that his life was remembered for what it had been. Bright, full of potential, full of love. Jamal had been a force for good, a force that was taken too soon. But Tiffany, along with his parents, his friends, the entire town, would keep that memory alive. They would carry Jamal with them always. But Tiffany had to reconcile with the reality that healing didn't mean forgetting. She didn't forget the way Jamal made her laugh, the way his eyes sparkled when he spoke about their future. She didn't forget the way he held her hand and told her time and again that they would be together forever. She didn't forget the night she waited at the Ferris wheel, desperately hoping he would come back. But she learned to carry the grief, to integrate it into her life, and to find meaning in the pain. Jamal's legacy would never be just about his death. It would always be about the life he lived. And Tiffany would carry that with her, as long as she lived. Sheriff Kyle Morrison, who had been the steady hand guiding the investigation toward its ultimate resolution, couldn't help but reflect on the weight of the case. He had seen a lot in his years as a lawman, but this one had weighed heavier than most. For him, this case had been more than just another investigation. It had been a test of his faith in justice, his belief that the truth would always come to light, no matter how long it took. But the truth, when it came, didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like a win. It felt like a deep, painful wound that had festered for far too long. The weight of Jamal's death had fallen on the entire town, not just on the Carter family, not just on Tiffany, but on everyone who knew him, everyone who had been touched by his spirit. And it was a burden that had never truly left them. Now, with the arrest of Ted Foster, there was a sense of finality to the case. But Morrison knew, deep in his heart, that this would never really be over for the people who had loved Jamal. They would carry the scars, the unanswered questions, and the pain of those lost years with them for the rest of their lives. As he sat in his office, Reflecting on the case that had haunted him for so long, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that the town of Redwood Valley would never fully recover from the shadows that had been cast over it. Jamal Carter's case may have been closed, but the story doesn't end there. It never truly ends for families like his. The scars of this case run deep, and the emotional toll will never fully be healed. And this raises a bigger question. What about the others? How many more families out there live with the same unanswered questions? How many other small towns, just like Redwood Valley, are quietly hiding dark secrets of their own? How many other cold cases are waiting for someone to finally unearth the truth? Sometimes the truth comes too late. Sometimes it's buried so deep, even the strongest can't reach it. But there's one thing we must remember. We must always keep searching for it. No matter how long it takes. No matter how much time has passed. We can never forget the ones who disappeared. We must always keep searching. I want to take a moment to say thank you, once again, to all my amazing subscribers. Your support keeps this channel alive and growing, and I couldn't do this without you. These stories take a lot of time and energy to research, write, and produce, but knowing that they're resonating with you is the reason I keep going. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect on the hidden secrets of small towns and how long it can take for justice to prevail, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let's continue to raise awareness and share stories that matter. Don't forget to share this video with someone who still believes that no mystery is truly closed, and that there's always a reason to keep searching. Turn on the notification bell so you're the first to know when I drop the next heart-wrenching, eye-opening case that will keep you coming back for more. If you want to dive into more cold cases and untold stories, check out my previous video. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. I'll see you in the next one.